Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Trauma Informed Church Kid Podcast. Before I get started on our journey through the scriptures, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you who showed up for the live launch party. I had lots of old friends on there, some family members, and some new friends as well. I sincerely appreciate the extra time it takes out of your days to stop by, watch and listen, and comment. It means an awful lot to me, and I hope that you will continue to show up for our live Q&R episodes as well. Looking forward to learning and growing with you all. Without further ado then, let's dive right in. In the beginning. It's a great place to start the scriptural story, and a great place to start our journey. This is where all the stories begin. Humanity, the earth, living things, the cosmos, and even the unseen realm. I'll unpack this stuff in more detail later, but the longer I study the scriptures, the more convinced I become that the first few chapters of Genesis, 1 through 11 in particular, are the interpretive key to understanding everything else that comes after. And before all you good church kids ask, well, what about Jesus? I mean that too. It's hard to understand who Jesus is without understanding what the image of God means, right here on page 1 of the Bible. It's hard to understand why he came to earth without understanding the 3 falls in Genesis 1 through 11. Yes, I said 3. It's hard to understand what our purpose as humans is without understanding the vocation of the garden. It's hard to understand what our destiny as humans is without understanding the sons of God language of Genesis 6, and on and on. Miss what is happening in the beginning, and you miss a lot. That's why for these first few chapters, we're going to do a slower and lower flyby than we will in other portions of the scriptures, so that we build a right foundation for the house that we will settle down and take up residence in. To that end, let me just begin by acknowledging the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I'm not going to go down the young earth, old earth, theistic evolution, creationism, etc. rabbit holes. Not even a little bit. I remember when I was in 8th grade, I had a science teacher who I argued with about all that. He asked the question in class, why does the giraffe have a long neck? I proudly raised my hand and defiantly said, because God made it that way. Needless to say, I got pulled outside in the hallway and chastised pretty firmly. And frankly, justly. I do not look back on that incident with pride. Not for any ideological reasons, but just because the way I went about it was all wrong. I frankly didn't care about the other kids in the class just trying to learn, my teacher just trying to do his job, or even my own intellectual duty to understand where other people were coming from. Frankly, for me, it was 100% performative, to be seen by others as, quote, standing up for what I believe, and to feel like I had, quote, done my Christian duty to fight back against the godless world. That is a seminal moment in my memory, and it is a path I want to encourage no one else to walk. And one of the biggest reasons for this is the ways in which a literal reading of Genesis 1 has caused some church hurt. In both my personal and professional experience, this text has been used as the litmus test for true faith. We believe the Bible is the inspired and inerrant word of God from its very first words, is something I've heard many times. What this has meant in practice is that any reading which is something other than a literal modernist historical account of CCTV footage of, quote, what really happened in the beginning, is seen as evidence that someone is sold out to liberal ideas, no longer views the Bible as being true or authoritative, or even that someone is not actually a Christian. Quite seriously, the way in which the phrase, in the beginning, is understood has been treated as the final arbiter of eternal destiny by some that I've been around. This is not the views of some fringe sect. This has been mainstream Christian belief in the circles I grew up in. That was a large reason why I had my giraffe moment in 8th grade science class, because I was convinced at the time that for me to accept any other account of creation besides a literal 6-day ex nihilo event would mean that I did not actually believe in the God of the Bible. So for me, in raising my hand, the stakes were incredibly high. I don't want to cover the truth or falsity of that claim in that particular interpretation, because I don't want to contribute to causing the same kind of existential dread that I and many others have felt. I want to focus on what I think the biblical authors themselves were actually saying to their original audience in their ancient context, and to see how we could apply that today in our world in a way that won't cause more hurt. So, what will that look like? Today, we'll be covering each day of creation in order to unpack what all 7 days are meant to convey. I have found enormous value in the scholar John Walton's Lost World series of books, which covers the first 6 books of the Bible, as well as a general big picture way to read and understand the text of Scripture. In there, he tries to recover the ancient Near East way of looking at the world, to let the text speak to 21st century ears using ancient language and thought categories. And by the way, I'll use the term ANE as a shorthand for ancient Near East throughout, so just get used to that. I highly recommend reading John Walton's book in this series relevant to what we're going to cover today, The Lost World of Genesis 1. For any who have read this book, much of what we will hit today will be familiar territory. The major themes we'll be encountering today are unpacking the literary and liturgical structure of creation, the similarities and differences of the Genesis account to other Mesopotamian creation accounts, the concepts of putting things in order and filling them with life, the unseen realm filled with dragons, beasts, and stars, and overall, what the goodness of creation means. Hence the title of our episode. That's quite a bit for just one episode, so let's begin. I want to start with day 0, or verse 2. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and God's Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters. Here we see that the earth was already around in some sense or other. The state of the primordial earth was what Bible Project scholar Tim Mackey calls wild and waste. It's formless and wild because things on the earth are not yet put in proper order. It's empty and waste because things are not yet filled with life. I like the way that Father Stephen DeYoung from the Whole Counsel of God podcast describes this. A world filled with life but without order is a swamp. He's from Louisiana, so he would know. A world put into order but without life is a parking lot. The primordial world is presented as somehow both a parking lot and a swamp. And yet, the Spirit, the Ruach or wind of God, is hovering over the waters of the deep. Try to picture this in your head. The land, lifeless and disordered. Next to it, the sea, chaotic and dark. And the wind hovering over both like a bird brooding over its nest. To really get a good grasp on what Genesis means by this image, we have to take a slight detour into the neighboring Semitic creation myths. In A&E cosmology, the deep or the abyss was the realm of the chaos dragon, a mythic force of nature who is always opposed to order in life. This chaos dragon who lives in the deep abyss went by many names: Tiamat, Tehom, Lotan, Letanu, or in the Bible we see this figure associated with Leviathan. This figure or figures is a kind of feminine aspect of the spiritual realm. The counterpart to this was a figure sometimes called Bull Baal, or the Bull of Heaven, also called Arshu, or in the Bible we see this figure or figures associated with Behemoth. This figure resides on the earth, or the underworld, and is the masculine aspect of the spiritual realm. Right here in the first 2 verses of Genesis, we see 2 halves of spiritual and material reality, masculine and feminine, the earth, or the underworld, and the sea, or the deep abyss. And high above them both, we have the wind, or air, or sky. In the thought world of Mesopotamia, the Most High God was called Anu and was the personification of the sky. We can see that the basic foundational elements of a creation myth are so far fairly similar in the A&E world to what we find in Genesis. And that's the first place I want to stop and acknowledge some things. I know that many people have experienced a crisis of faith, or even a loss of faith, when they encounter these similarities to neighboring creation myths. Here in Genesis, we see a creation myth with some of the same figures. There is a flood narrative. There is a narrative of forbidden knowledge given to humanity, etc. Many people I've encountered will see this and think that the Judeo-Christian narrative is just another one among many. Often they look at some of the elements in the Genesis story and think that they are just as barbaric and primitive as some of the ones from Ugarit or Akkad or Sumer or Babylon. I first of all just want to acknowledge how unsettling it can be to discover this for the first time. Frankly, it can feel shocking, and it can make one question if it really is true or not. But beyond this, these kinds of questions and fears are often not welcome in a religious setting. Pointing this out can wind up in getting shamed into silence, being called out for, quote, lack of faith, or being lumped in with skeptical or antagonistic groups of people. When all along, very often, all that's attempting to be expressed by these questions is a fear that what was always presented as unique and special now no longer feels unique and special. Most of the people I've encountered asking these questions are genuinely looking for an answer, something to settle their soul and calm their fears, and instead they're just told to stop reading secular scholarship, or even have their character or motivations attacked. I just want to first of all acknowledge that this hurt is valid. These fears are real, and that your questions are welcome here. My hope isn't to give you just another answer that stops all questions, but to start to offer a different perspective in response to those questions so that we can continue on a journey of discovery together. And the first response I want to suggest is that rather than zooming in on the similarities, what happens if we zoom in on the differences? Let's take a look at that in one instance. The Babylonian creation myth, called the Enuma Elish, describes the god Marduk defeating Tiamat and splitting her in half to create the earth and the sky. The blood of Tiamat dripped onto the earth, and out of the mixture of god blood and clay came humans. This violent scene is typical of what later German theologians would call Chaoskampf, the struggle of the gods. All of the cultures surrounding the ancient Hebrews had similar myths about the creation of the heavens, the earth, and humans. In those narratives, the gods always had to engage in war of some kind to bring about their desired outcome, and it usually involved the death and or dismemberment of their divine rivals. Humans were at best a byproduct of this Chaoskampf and were designed to exist as servants to attend to the needs of the gods. The Genesis narrative is notably different. It depicts God in complete control, which we modern people might be surprised to discover is unique. The concept of omnipotence was absent from the ancient ideas of godhood, so far as we've found. No culture made the claim that their deity was all-powerful. They depicted their gods as having to wrestle their divine antagonists into submission. For the Genesis narrative, the breath or the wind or the spirit of God is supervising over the two primordial halves of reality, Leviathan and Behemoth. However, rather than fighting a violent war to create the heavens and the earth, all God does is speak, and these forces are put into proper submission. Also, in A&E cultures, there is what is called the, quote, succession myth, where a junior god rebels against the Most High God, usually his father, and kills or imprisons him. This is absent from the Genesis narrative. There, even in the wild and waste, and darkness and deep, the divine spirit is carefully keeping watch over these terrifying spiritual beings. Only in Genesis, this twisting serpent dragon and this raging bull beast are depicted like baby birds in God's nest, with the spirit hovering over them, keeping them in line. Quite the different image for sure. As before, if zooming in on these differences doesn't erase all doubts and fears and questions, that's fine. I hope that it at least starts to cause a flicker of light to be visible in the midst of the darkness you might feel. And speaking of which, that's exactly what happens next. God says, "Let there be light." This is the beginning of a series of the first 3 days of creation, the goal of each of which is to bring order to chaos. This is signaled to us by the words separated or divided, depending on your translation, which reoccurs throughout these first 3 days. The concept of placing boundaries, of putting things in their proper place and defining their limitations is central to the biblical concept of order and also justice. Day 1 of creation depicts God putting the primordial darkness into order by his Spirit, bringing fire and light into darkness and despair. This space is an image of putting the heavens into order and begins the subduing of all of these forces of chaos and darkness. Day 2 continues the theme of putting things into order. The waters above and the waters below are divided. In the cosmological imagination of the A&E world, we need to picture a flat earth held up by pillars, surrounded by a circular dome. The top half circle is the sky, whose boundaries are the firmament, above which are the waters above. The bottom half circle is the deep or the abyss, and these are the waters below. Day 2 is describing putting Leviathan in order, the separation of the waters. Day 3 describes another separation or division. The waters in the top half of our cosmic dome are being gathered together and separated from the dry land. This is an example of putting Behemoth in order, as evidenced by what happens next. Plant life appears on the formerly wild and waste earth. For each of these first 3 days of creation, the Genesis narrative is showing us a Most High God who is in control of primordial chaos, who puts it into order with his word and not a war, in order to make them places which are ready to receive life. And that's what happens on the following 3 days of creation. Each of those previously disordered spaces are filled with life. Day 1 connects to day 4. The sun, moon, and stars populate the heavens. You might wonder how that is being filled with life, but again, we need to step into the thought world of the ancient Near East. There, all the celestial bodies were considered to be manifestations of divine beings. This is why there are sun gods like Chemosh and moon gods like Nana. There is also a conviction that all the stars are extensions of other lesser divine beings called Elohim. This will be a really significant point in just a few chapters, but for now I'll just flag day 4 of creation as being not just about balls of gas and rock. This day of creation is set up for its original readers to see the heavens being filled with different kinds of divine life, all finding their source and sustenance in the one who is God above the gods. Day 5 connects to day 2 and follows the same thread of filling the ordered spaces with life. The skies and the seas are filled with living beings. The Hebrew word there is nephesh, and I'm afraid I'm just going to have to tease the later importance of that term as well. For now, just notice that the separation of the waters above and the waters below to create the sky and the sea is what makes this space ready to be filled with birds and fish, sky flyers and sea swarmers. Day 6 connects to day 4, where God takes the newly ordered earth and fills it with life. This is presented like God subduing, again with a word, Behemoth, just as the previous paired set of days can be seen as God subduing Leviathan. Animals and reptiles and anything with 4 legs explode all over the ground. These two are called nephesh, and God says of them the same thing that he said about every aspect of creation before this. It was good. The Hebrew word for good here is tov, and it is an incredibly expansive word. It doesn't just mean a quick thumbs up. It means a sigh of relief, because things that were put out of order are being put back into order, that what was dead is now alive. It means fullness and favor and flourishing, not just goodness, but beauty also. This is a really important point to highlight, because here again is another way that religion has caused hurt. The church and church people have often lost sight of the goodness of creation. Robin Phillips has written an excellent book about this, Rediscovering the Goodness of Creation, which he subtitled A Handbook for Recovering Gnostics. The Gnostics, for anyone who doesn't know, were an ancient sect from the first few centuries after Christ, and their main tenet was that the physical and material world was the product of a rival god called the Demiurge. They believed that flesh and bodies and earthly stuff were all bad, and that the goal of life is to escape this, quote, prison house of matter and become pure spirit. This idea of reality might sound very familiar to many people who grew up in the church, as essentially what they have been taught and learned. Bodies are bad. The earth is primed for destruction, so why polish the brass on the Titanic? This perspective has been used to justify everything from the excesses of purity culture, patriarchy, cheap forgiveness, and a callous disregard for the environment. I believe that we will see there is a better way to read Genesis, but again, I think it is important to amplify those experiences and acknowledge the hurt and pain this has caused to many. To suggest an antidote to this latent Gnosticism, this is why the Christian doctrine of the image of God and humanity is so crucially important. Here I will be leaning very heavily on Dr. Carmen Imes's excellent book, Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. I would highly recommend anyone who wants to learn more to read more about the image of God here, and we will cover this in more depth in the next episode. But for today, In Dr. Imes's book, she calls humans the crown of creation. Unlike the creation myths of Mesopotamia, the creation of mankind did not come as the semi-accidental byproduct of violent struggle in the heavens, nor is the purpose of humankind to be slaves to the gods. The purpose of humankind is to be the tselem, or image, of the God who is above the gods. Whenever this word is used throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, it tends to regularly refer to the word idol. There is some brief background information we have to download from the ancient Near East to more fully understand what Genesis is saying. Please hang with me, we're nearing the end. John Walton notes that the sequence of creation is set up in parallel to building a cosmic temple, a dwelling place for divinity. In the A&E, what would happen is that the temple would be built, and then the priest would place an image, or idol, of the god in the temple. This tselem would then be seen as an extension of the god, what in Greek philosophical categories we would come to know as a hypostasis. What that means is that the god would not just inhabit the tselem, kind of like a demon possession. The god would be seen to work through the tselem. It was viewed as literally a body of the divine, a way in which the spiritual being acts and is present in the world of space and time and matter. Mark Cortez has a great way to phrase this. We need to view the image of God as a declaration that God intended to create human persons to be the physical means through which he would manifest his own divine presence in the world. And this is what God calls very good. Humankind as God's body on earth, continuing his work of creation. That is why God then rests on this seventh day, the Sabbath. This language is often taken to mean that he takes a nap or something, but really what it means in the primeval thought world is that he sat down on his throne. He takes up residence in his newly built cosmic temple, settling in as its rightful king to rule over his dominion with his images as his vice-regents. In Genesis, creation is not perfect. It is, quote, very good. It will be the humans who will bring it to its perfection or completion, bringing the reign of the king to any part of creation which is out of order. There is a fractal image of work and rest in the creation of Genesis 1. God works for 6 days and then sits down on his throne. Humans, as the crown of God's creation and the embodied presence of God on earth, work for 6 days and then sit down on their throne, so to speak. In the cycles of the days of creation, humans are the physical means of manifesting the divine presence and rule. And that is the best way to read the seventh-day Sabbath rest. It is the kingdom of God manifesting itself as a symbolic, quote, day. On the Sabbath, creation receives the rule and reign it is designed to have, God sitting down on his throne with humans on earth as his family members, ruling as his images. So, explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay? Ready? God is so big, he can make everything with a word. He put the heavens and the earth in order, and then he filled them both with life of every kind. The best news of all is, he made a family of people to show the whole earth who God is and what he is like. Our job is to keep God's good creation good, and that makes us very good. I really hope this image of the goodness of creation helps us to see how any doctrine which denies this is fundamentally anti-Genesis. The Hebrew Scriptures subversively utilize the thought world and the mythological categories of their Mesopotamian neighbors in service of a picture of creation which elevates humankind, that demonstrates the utter uniqueness of God, and which gives a clear purpose that moves the narrative forward, to bring the benevolent rule and reign of God to all the wild and waste places. My prayer is that this picture of Genesis 1 and some brief parts of chapter 2 has helped to reconstruct a picture of God and religion which doesn't hurt either your head or your heart. I always welcome feedback, so feel free to comment on our Facebook group if you have some thoughts on the content of today's episode. You'll find the link to that in the show notes and on our Podbean HQ. That address again is churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, including Apple, Spotify, Audible, iHeartRadio, and many others. You can also find me on social media, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on X, where I am at ChurchKidPod on all of those. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started and get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give us a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give us any respect. And without those sweet, sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback and to improve wherever I can. So now, having done that little plug, my offer to you is to get out there and do the work. What are the ways you can reflect the goodness of God to His creation this week? What are the ways that you can bring order to your everyday life? And how can you fill what is empty with life and beauty? How can you make it tov? How could you make your house, your family, your neighborhood into something that subdues the powers of darkness and chaos, not with violent struggle, but with a good word? And finally, how can you rediscover the goodness of God's creation today? I will leave you with that challenge, and I look forward to hearing how you all decide to. I will leave you with that challenge, and look forward to hearing how you all decide to do that this week. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.